Natural selection. We're going to look at 4 types of natural selection and then quickly talk about chance selection. Recall that variability is a result of genetic mutations, and so the reason why a population is variable, why every individual of a particular species is not the same, is because of genetic mutations. Then, because of the difference in genes, there's also the difference in recombination and the independent assortment that we see for species that reproduce sexually anyways. They can combine their chromosomes in different ways by chance, and so we also see variation amongst populations because of that. It's all based on random genetic mutations, DNA copying errors that happen when a cell is being reproduced. Then, for sexually reproducing organisms, they can recombine their chromosomes differently, which would lead to even more variation. But all of it is by chance. Variation is by chance. Natural selection then acts upon that genetic variation that arose by chance, but natural selection will act upon that within a species. The variation is due to chance. Natural selection acts upon the variation. So, looking at this picture here, the fact that we have some beetles that are orange and some beetles that are green, that would have arisen from a genetic mutation that would have occurred by chance. It may be passed on through different recombination, different ways of inheriting, but it arose through random chance. Then the environment that the beetles are in will act upon that variation in a particular way. However, the environment happens to favor or disfavor those particular traits. So it's an environment where these birds happen to like to eat the green ones, then they will be eliminated from the population, and over time the population's characteristics would slowly change. That's evolution. Let's look at an example. Sickle cell anemia. So here is Africa, and here is some prevalence of this particular genetic trait called sickle cell anemia that's due to a single base pair mutation, genetic mutation that has occurred from a particular random mutation. Now, the distribution of that trait happens to be in a very high in a particular area, and so we can see that where if we look sort of around where the equator is, essentially the prevalence of this particular genetic trait, which arose through random mutation, is quite high in this particular area of this continent. Now, why would that be? That the mutation was a random event. However, the environment could then select for those mutations. So if the mutation is very high in a particular area, there must be a reason for that. The environment must be selecting for that trait. And it turns out that though the mutation happened randomly, and there's all sorts of consequences to having this particular mutation, if you are a heterozygous carrier for the allele for sickle cell anemia, then you actually have a better protection against malaria. So malaria is not going to affect you as much if you are a carrier for sickle cell anemia. So this randomly developed mutation happened to occur, and then for this particular environment, that trait, as long as you're heterozygous for it, gave you a selective advantage. So the environment selected for people who have this particular mutation, and therefore it makes sense that if you live in an environment where malaria is prevalent, there would be a higher incidence of sickle cell anemia because there's actually an advantage to being a carrier for that trait in an environment where malaria is prevalent. The mutation is random. The environment then selects for those mutations. Quick thing about traits within a population. So regardless of what type of species you're talking about, generally traits follow a normal distribution, where wherever the quantification of the trait is, whatever the trait is, there's going to be a distribution along this sort of spread here that we have. So the number of individuals with a particular trait. So let's say it is, I don't know, the length of the legs of gazelle. So gazelles have a certain length of leg where, let's say, I don't know, it's 2 meters or whatever, however long their legs are. So most of them have legs that are about that length. However, there are some gazelle that have shorter legs, and there are some gazelle that have longer legs. So if you took a population of 1,000 gazelle, you measured all their legs, their distribution of that particular trait would look something like this for most traits in most populations. Then we can look at it as, well, how is the environment going to play and select for these particular traits that we have in the environment? So let's look at 3 different ways that this can work. First off is called directional selection, where individuals with a more extreme variation of a particular trait are going to be selected for. They're the ones with the advantage in a particular environment. So let's say that this dotted line is the original population, and let's say, I don't know, maybe it is gazelle leg length, and so most of them are around the 2-meter length, but there's some that have a 1-meter length. And then you have some lions chasing you, and having longer legs happens to be an advantage. So all these ones here with short legs get killed off. And the ones that have longer legs are the ones that reproduce. So what happens is the distribution of this trait for leg length may be shifted to one side in a particular direction. That's called directional selection. Stabilizing selection is where the average phenotype is selected for, and the extremes die out. And so we have a normal distribution for a particular trait, and for a particular reason, the ones that have an extreme to one side or the other, so very small or very large for whatever this particular trait happens to be, are selected against. So they get killed off, and the ones that survive are the ones that are more average for that particular trait. And this is called stabilizing selection. The third type that we're going to look at is called disruptive selection, and this is where the contrasting phenotypes, the extremes, are selected for, and the intermediate, the medium ones, die out. So whatever the trait is, if the middle line here is the one that the environment doesn't like, and it prefers one extreme and the other extreme, then we're going to end up with the distribution moving in 2 directions. We'll have more individuals with a smaller version of that extreme, and we'll have more individuals with a larger version of that extreme. So it disrupts the distribution of that particular trait. Let's look at this applied to some hummingbirds. So imagine we have a population of hummingbirds, and we expose them to 3 different environments, or maybe there's a change in environment, or whatever happens to be. We end up with 3 different environments for these hummingbirds to exist in. The first one we'll look at is an environment that has flowers that are very deep. So hummingbirds drink the nectar at the bottom of the flower. So if the flowers are very deep, it's going to affect how successful the hummingbirds are based on the length of their beak. So first environment, imagine we have deep flowers. The second environment, imagine having normal-sized medium flowers. And the third environment that we'll look at, imagine having only flowers that are very deep, or flowers that are not deep at all, very shallow. First example would lead to directional selection. So the hummingbird population has a variety of bill lengths. And think of that normal distribution. Some have short bills, some have long bills. Most of them are medium-sized. And the flowers work for those ones. However, imagine a new habitat that has deep flowers. So if you have more flowers that are deeper, having a longer bill would be an advantage. The environment would select for longer-billed birds. They would be more successful. They would have more offspring. These guys here with the longer bills would do better because this new environment has deeper flowers. So if you have longer bills, you get more food, you can produce more offspring. And what would happen is that over time, so what the distribution used to be like this, it is now like that. It has moved in one direction. There are now more birds with longer bills than there used to be. That is directional selection, and it could work in the direction of longer bills, or maybe in the opposite direction with shorter bills if you had shorter flowers. Stabilizing selection would be an environment where you have sort of just medium flowers. They're not changing. You don't have deep flowers, you don't have shallow flowers. They're just medium flowers. So short bills aren't an advantage because they're not long enough to get to the bottom of the flower, so they wouldn't get as much nectar, so they would be disadvantaged. The environment would not select for them. So these guys would not be favored because they can't get enough nectar. Long bills, they can get the nectar, but the problem is these traits are costly. If you want to grow an extra long bill, that's going to take more energy. So if you don't need it, and you're spending the energy building these extra long bills just because that's what your genetics are telling your body to do, they would actually be selected for as well. Not because they don't get enough food, because they're not efficient in the way that they use resources. So the ones in the middle here would have an advantage over both the ones that don't get enough food and the birds, the longer bills that are spending too much energy building their bills. The medium average gets selected for, and then the population becomes more narrow around that particular average of bill length. Last example would be disruptive selection. So imagine an environment that had long bills, deep flowers that favored long-billed birds, and then there was another flower that just had short depth to it that favored the short-billed birds. So medium is not being favored. If you had a medium beak, you can't drink from the long flowers, and you've got more bill than you need for the short flowers, so that would put you at a disadvantage as well. And the birds that had long bills would do well with the long flowers, the birds that had short bills would do well with the short flowers, and they would both have an advantage over the medium billed birds. And so the population would end up with a bimodal distribution. You'd have lots of birds with long bills, you'd have lots of birds with short bills, and very few in the middle, because it is not advantageous to have that length of bill. What's amazing is that over a long enough period of time, these two populations, this divergence, can get more and more extreme to the point where the two different groups are so different they don't recognize each other as the same species anymore. And we end up with, over a long period of time, many generations under these particular conditions can lead to distinct species. Another type of selection is called sexual selection, and it is based on, and it would only work for organisms where you have different sexes within the species, and it's the preference of one sex for certain characteristics in the other sex. So, for example, traits that enhance mating success are going to be favored. And often you can see the result of this is that the two different sexes of the same species look different. And so peacocks are a classic example where the males have this giant tail and the females don't. And so that must be showing some type of sexual selection. The reason why males and females are going to be so different for that particular species. It could be based on intersexual selection. So we're talking about the two different sexes, so the females selecting for the males or the males selecting for the females, with a male-female doing the selection, in which one sex chooses the other based upon some type of behavior or ornamental way that they look. So for example, this happens a lot with birds. A lot of male birds are very colorful because the females are going to be selecting males that can display a particular trait. Now the females aren't often going to be so colorful because the males aren't going to be selecting for those traits. But if the females select for a particular trait, it's going to become more prevalent in the males because the ones that have it will be the ones that reproduce successfully. This can also be found in mandrills as well. They have these very colorful faces, and it is probably the result of sexual selection because they're being selected for because of those traits. Then there could also be intrasexual selection, and so this is within the same sex. So for example, if males have to compete for territory or access to mates, what can happen is they end up with particular traits that allow them to be successful for that. The females may not care for those traits, as long as they don't discare for them. It could actually develop because of intrasexual selection. So if two males have to fight for territory, having giant horns or antlers could actually help them to do that. And if they have bigger antlers, they might win more fights and have more territory and therefore be more sexually selected for because they can actually have an advantage of securing that territory. So that would be intrasexual selection. Then we have evolutionary change without selection. So where the populations change over time, but it's not due to natural selection. And this has to be due to something random. So we can refer to this as genetic drift, where the random shifting of genetic makeup, which is not due to natural selection. Generally this happens with smaller populations, or at least the influence will be greater on smaller populations, and it tends to lead to a loss of diversity. two main things that can cause this to happen that we're going to look at that would lead to a reduction in the size of the population, which would make for a smaller population, which would make for a greater genetic drift. First one is referred to the bottleneck effect, and they're kind of similar, the two of them. But this is a huge reduction in population due to a chance event, and this will again lead to a loss in genetic diversity. The smaller the population, the less genetic diversity there must be within that population, because if you lose some individuals within a diverse population, you're going to lose some of those traits. So any rare alleles are going to become less prevalent or eliminated. So you can imagine a population, a very simple application of this, where we have, let's say, a yellow trait, a blue trait, and a red trait. Then let's say there is a bottleneck. So something happens where only a few of the individuals survive, and all the rest are eliminated. So just randomly, whoever happens to survive will have particular traits, and then those traits are going to be passed on to the next generation. And then as the population rebuilds itself, whatever traits that got eliminated during the bottleneck will no longer be in the new population. So that's a bottleneck effect. Similar to that would be a founder effect, and this is where you have a small random sample of a population generally moving to a new area that is no longer reproducing with the original area. So it's an isolated area, and because this was a small sample, it's going to reduce the genetic variation of that new population. So you can imagine some individuals move to a isolated island or something like that. Whatever genetic traits they bring with them will be in the new population, but whatever genetic traits were left behind in the rest of the population that didn't move will no longer be there. So it's a founder effect. So imagine you've got a bunch of beetles, and some of the beetles, one here, but imagine some of them move to a new area or end up somehow on a new island. As long as they're isolated and they're not in contact with the original population, whatever traits don't come with them will not be in the new, less genetically diverse population.